yours truly Johnny Dollar episode, the Suicidal Bicycle Matter, that's coming up on the Joe Bev Show. Johnny Dollar.
Pat McCracken, Johnny. Universal Adjustment Bureau.
Pat, how you doing?
Not bad, Johnny. Not bad. Listen, I've got a case that needs your immediate attention. There's this...
Whoa, Pat. You caught me walking out the door. I'm on my way to catch up on my fishing. It's been...
Seamus O'Shea. You ever hear of him? Johnny owns a bunch of restaurants in Manhattan.
Well, no, Pat, I haven't. But I'm catching a plane in an hour for Lake Mojave. Give me a break, will you?
Today's paper, Johnny. You got it?
I haven't got the paper, Pat. Fish don't read.
Page 3. This guy O'Shea holds a $500,000 life insurance policy through limited liability and trust out of New York. He turned up dead last night at the bottom of a deep embankment by the West Side Highway, up around 103rd Street. He was taking his daily bike ride, made a turn off the embankment. Johnny, you there?
Yeah, Pat, I'm here. Murder?
Broken neck. Official cause of death is suicide.
So, insurance doesn't pay off in the event of a suicide.
The policy's 3 years old.
Oh.
There's a clause in the policy. It's a little-known fact that insurance companies will have to pay off on a suicide if the policy's been in effect for over 2 years.
Who's the beneficiary?
His wife, Johnny, the former Pye Parker of Nashville, Tennessee.
Did you say Pie, Pat? What kind of a name is Pie?
Well, when you've seen her, you'll see that the name fits. Good enough to eat. She's a knockout, Johnny, and 30 years younger than her husband.
Then you think she killed him?
Why else? Why else would I be calling you? Insurable interest, Johnny, my boy. We prove she bumped him off. The insurance company saves himself $500,000. You interested?
My usual expenses?
Johnny, you pin this one on the wife, you can put your fishing on the expense account. Hell, you could probably do that anyway.
You know me too well, Pat. I'm on my way.
The exciting adventures of the man with the action-packed expense account. America's fabulous freelance insurance investigator.
Yours truly, Johnny Dollar. Expense account submitted by Special Investigator Johnny Dollar to Pat McCracken, Universal Adjustment Bureau. The following is a list of expenditures incurred during my investigation of the Suicidal Bicycle Matter. Item 1, $50 deposit on a rental car. I drove from my Connecticut home, arriving in Midtown Manhattan a little after noon. Item 2, $100 in advance for 4 days at the Empire Hotel off Columbus Circle. Next stop, Lieutenant Charles Walters, first whip of the 24th Precinct's Detective Squad. It was a nice spring day, so I decided to walk the 40 blocks uptown to the West Harlem location of the station house. Item 3, 25 cents for a hot dog with the works, and a Coke from a street vendor on Broadway. I'm going easy on you, Pat. I could have eaten at the Copa. Charles Walters was a career cop who had seen too much and compensated for it by stuffing his face with free meals from the numerous restaurants which dotted the Upper West Side. Charles's motto was, "A good cop never gets hungry, thirsty, or wet." Words to live by. I'd known Charles for years and liked him. We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes after he ushered me into his tiny office. I sat in an uncomfortable metal folding chair while he parked himself in an overstuffed leather throne he probably liberated from a bookie's wire room.
So what brings you to my fair city, Johnny?
His ample girth tortured the buttons on his shirt. I didn't know you owned New York, Charlie.
Cops run this town, Johnny. We just let the politicians think they do. Spill.
Seamus O'Shea.
Yeah, so? Suicide. Drove his bike off a mini-cliff in Riverside Park by the West Side Highway. Why would you guys care about a suicide? This guy was a health nut. 67 years old, and he thought he was 30. I guess he was trying to keep up with his wife, huh? You ought to see this dame. Oh.
I heard. Get to the bike.
Oh, yeah. Well, every morning about 7, he does a few miles in the park. Here's a picture of the crumpled bike. One of those 3-speed English jobs. They're just becoming popular in this country. You could have set your watch by the guy. But anyway, he's tooling up the path next to the highway when he suddenly cuts the wheel sharp to the left, and over he goes. About a 40-foot drop. DOA. Case closed.
This guy was insured for $500K, Charlie. Doesn't that raise a flag?
Well, you mean his wife? Well, sure, of course, but we got us a witness. Saw the whole thing. And from the time O'Shea rounded a curve at 122nd Street until he did the Brody at 103rd Street. Damn, mind if I have a cigarette? Would you like one?
No, thanks.
You give up?
Yeah. Someday we'll find out that cigarettes can kill you. Just want to beat the devil.
Yeah. Sure. And milk is bad for you too, right?
Well, you never know. Was O'Shea despondent?
Well, his wife says he was. A couple of restaurants going under. His only son killed 6 months ago in Korea. Could have put him over the edge.
Anyone else say he was suicidal?
We spoke to a bunch of his employees. They said he was quiet. Kept pretty much to himself.
Relatives?
No, just the wife.
Soon to be a very rich widow.
That don't make her a killer, Johnny.
Sure gives her incentive, though.
Witness his name and the address where he'd be for a while in my fair city. He's visiting a college professor from Pennsylvania.
Professor Danton Marilu. My next stop. Item 4. $1 cab fare with tip to Ambassador Hotel, West End Avenue, 116th Street. The Ambassador Hotel was favored by higher education types because of its close proximity to Columbia University. It had seen better days, but I'm sure the rates were better than the Waldorf. The desk clerk directed me to room 338, third floor, rear. The ancient elevator operator told me that it was one of the last steam-powered elevators in the city. I could have crawled backwards up the stairs quicker. I was about to knock on the door to room 338 when it swung open. A thin man in his early 30s, balding, wearing a 3-piece suit, wireframe glasses, and holding a briefcase, stopped short.
Yes? Oh, yes?
Professor Danton Marilu?
Yes.
By card.
Johnny Dollar, special investigator. Is this about the poor man in the park? Oh my, the one on the bike?
Yes, sir. I'm an insurance investigator. The deceased was heavily insured. Just like to ask you a few questions. May I come in?
Oh dear. Oh, well, I was just going out. I'm on my way to the library on 42nd Street. Research on a paper. Well, I suppose I could spare a few minutes.
We went inside. I sat on a threadbare sofa while the professor stood by a window. What do you teach, Professor?
Oh, English literature. I'm in town for only a few days before I journey to London.
He looked in the direction of a hot plate perched next to a rusting sink.
I'd offer you something, Mr. Dollar, but as you can see, this is just a temporary domicile. A place to hang one's hat, so to speak.
I don't want to waste your time, Professor. If you can tell me what you saw that day, I'll be on my way.
Oh, surely. Why, of course.
He told me pretty much the same thing Charlie Walters had recounted. He was taking a morning stroll in the park.
I miss the rural quality of Pennsylvania, Mr. Dollar. Riverside Park isn't exactly the Laurel Mountains, you see, but at least it's got trees. As I neared 103rd Street, I spotted the late Seamus O'Shea cruising down the path, yes, at a great rate of speed. He was moving quite rapidly, Mr. Dollar. He had a crazed expression on his face, like he was building up courage to do something.
Tell me about the exact moment he went over the edge.
Well, maybe he looked me right in the eye, Mr. Dollar. Right in the eye. Turned the wheel sharply to the left. And it disappeared down the hill. Oh, my, oh dear. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Dollar, but I'm just not used to...
Sure, Professor. What did you do then?
I looked down the embankment. He wasn't moving. It was quite a steep grade. There was no discernible way I could safely navigate the hill. I ran out of the park and dialed the operator for the police from a phone booth on Broadway. Then I went back to the scene to await their arrival.
Yes, very civic-minded of you. I was wondering, Professor, could you give me your address in Pennsylvania? You know, just in case we have to reach you in the future.
Well, I won't be home for quite a while, sir.
How long's quite a while?
Up to 2 months, depending on how involved I become with my research project.
These things sometimes take a long time to settle.
You mean the insurance?
I mean the insurance.
Oh, well, yes, of course. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Dollar, I really must be going.
Certainly. I rose. As I walked past the end table by the bed, I noticed a framed picture of 2 young boys. Yours?
My sons, Peter and Max. Max is the oldest. Hard to tell them apart, isn't it, Mr. Dollar?
I held the photograph for a few minutes before handing it back. Indeed it is. Your only 2 children?
Why, yes. Why?
No reason. Just like kids. $0.10 for a phone call to the home of the late Seamus O'Shea. A woman answered.
Hello?
She had the sweetest southern drawl I'd ever heard. It poured from her like fresh maple syrup. I told her who I was and why I wanted to see her.
Certainly, Mr. Dollar. Are you familiar with Queens?
I told her that I was, and she gave me directions to her house that sounded as if she was reading poetry. I'll be there in an hour.
Looking forward to it,
she said breathlessly. She wasn't the only one. Item 6, $1.50 for a quick lunch with tip at an Irish pub on Amsterdam Avenue. I picked up the rental car from in front of my hotel and made it to Pi O'Shea's house. Mansion was a more apt description, with 5 minutes to spare. To say that O'Shea's widow was pretty was like calling the Mona Lisa a picture. She was absolutely stunning. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was carefully disarranged in what was supposed to look naturally windblown, but which must have taken her a while to put together. It worked for me. I put her at about 5'8", and she appeared even taller due to her lithe frame. She had the creamiest complexion I'd ever seen on a woman, with gleaming white teeth behind red lipstick. She was wearing pleated white pants and a pale blue silk blouse. She was beautiful enough to make a rabbi go to church. She swung the door wide.
Mr. Dollar, come in.
I followed her into a sunken living room. I would have followed her anywhere. She glided onto a sofa and patted the cushion next to her.
Please sit.
I sat. We stared at each other for a few seconds until she broke the ice.
You had some questions, Mr. Dollar?
Oh, yes, questions. Your late husband, Mrs. O'Shea.
Please, Mr. Dollar, call me Pie.
I'd call her Frank if she wanted me to. Yes, of course. Well, Pie, could you tell me where you were when your husband was... died?
You get right to the point, Mr. Dollar. Don't you?
Just doing my job.
First of all, aren't we talking about a suicide here, Mr. Dollar?
Well, that's what I'm paid to find out, ma'am. Pie. She crossed her legs and settled back into the couch.
Okay, I'll play. I was here, Mr. Dollar, alone. Seamus went to his Broadway restaurant every morning. That's where he kept the bicycle. He'd ride for a while, the first thing every day.
Forgive me for saying this, Pie, but you don't seem very broken up over your husband's death.
You aren't from the South, are you, Mr. Dollar?
Southern part of Bridgeport, Connecticut. That count?
Not where I come from, sir. I've been taught to contain my emotions in public.
Old Southern tradition?
Old Parker tradition. I loved my husband, Mr. Dollar. He was older, but that didn't make him any less a good husband, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I know what you mean.
A drink, Mr. Dollar?
Bourbon would be nice.
You must have some Southern blood in you.
She poured my drink, none for her. She told me that she never drank. Offering me one was just Southern hospitality. I made a mental note to move to Tennessee when I retire. Let's assume that your husband's death wasn't a suicide. Do you know anyone who would want your husband dead?
You mean other than me?
Yes, Pie, other than you.
My husband's partner, Alvin Carpus, stood to gain. They had survivor's insurance. If ever one of them died, the partner would inherit the business.
You mean you don't get the restaurants?
Correct.
I loved the way she said that word. Okay, she was out of the restaurants, but she still came away with $500,000. If that wasn't a motive for murder, nothing was. Pie O'Shea gave me Carpus's address. We parted at the door with a handshake. Her hand was as soft as her voice. She held on to it as she said,
If my husband was murdered, Mr. Dollar, the killer had better hope you'll find him before I do.
Southern hospitality?
The Southern justice. Another old family tradition. Good day, Mr. Dollar.
She turned her pretty heels and shut the door. I just stood there for a few seconds. I mentally smoked a cigarette. I needed one. I visited the scene of the suicide, accident, murder, whatever it was. Riverside Park stretched from 72nd Street several miles uptown. Parts of it were deserted, as was the path where Seamus O'Shea met his end. The path he rode his bike on was just about wide enough for the bike. Maintaining any significant speed and being able to control the bike would have been difficult. Did he swerve to avoid something? I looked down the hill at the exact spot where Seamus took his flyer. A yellow NYPD crime scene tape was stretched between two trees. Quite a fall. Not many would have survived it. Item 7, $1.85 for a long-distance call to the Somerset, Pennsylvania Police Department, where I confirmed that Professor Danton Marrowlew did in fact reside in the town and was on educational sabbatical. He had 2 sons, named Peter and Max. The professor's physical description fit too. Hey, you never know. I'm paid to cover all bases. Still, something was nagging me about Marrowlew. Item 8, 25 cents, toll for the George Washington Bridge. Alan Carpus lived in an upscale neighborhood in Fort Lee, New Jersey. I parked my rental car in a gravel driveway, went to the door of the well-cared-for English tutor, and knocked. There was no answer. but I distinctly heard the metallic sound of a lawnmower in motion coming from the rear of the house. I walked back there through heavily leaved maple trees. A well-built man in his 30s, wearing shorts and stripped to the waist, was pushing the mower up a slight grade. I cleared my throat, and he turned.
Can I help you?
I identified myself. Like to ask you some questions about your partner's death?
Well, let's go in the house then. Give me an excuse to goof off.
We sat in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the spotless windows. He offered me a drink, and I settled for ice water.
What can I do for you, Mr. Dollar?
We're trying to determine the cause of death of Mr. Seamus. I thought you might be able to help.
Cause of death? I thought the police ruled it a suicide.
They did. We didn't. I went through the same questions I asked Pye Parker. Got basically the same answers. He'd been in business together for 10 years. Get along?
As well as any partners. He had his life outside the restaurants, and I had mine.
Married?
Divorced.
How well do you know Mrs. O'Shea?
Not well, really. She'd come down to our Chambers Street restaurant occasionally. Other than seeing her there, I couldn't say that I knew her well.
You own the Empire now, is that right?
And you're implying what, Mr. Dollar?
No implications, just asking questions.
A question you already know the answer to, Mr. Dollar. I'm sure. I resent this line of questioning. Let's cut to the chase, shall we? I did not kill my partner. The interview is over.
Item 9. $66 for an English racing bike, similar to the one Seamus O'Shea was riding when he went over the embankment to his death. I rode the bike into Central Park, which was located just across the street from my hotel. It was a sunny day, a little warm for spring, but nice weather had brought throngs of people into the park. I found a fairly unpopulated asphalt roadway and conducted an experiment. After a few bumps and bruises, I believe I had my killer. I waited for 3 hours for Professor Dainton Marilu to emerge from his hotel. It was a little after 8 p.m., and the sun had just dipped below the New Jersey horizon. Marilu had abandoned his school teacher costume for a light windbreaker, chinos, and a dirty pair of Keds. He walked briskly to the Broadway subway station, with me a respectable distance behind. Marilu took the Downtown Express to Grand Central Station and the number 7 train to Roosevelt Avenue in Queens. I could have blindfolded myself after that and knew exactly where he was going, to the home of Pye O'Shea, grieving widow. I waited behind a mailbox down the street from the O'Shea house. It was dark by this time, but I could see the shadowy figure of Marilu standing at the front door. It opened shortly, and Pye O'Shea stood silhouetted in light imitated from the interior of the house. Even at this distance, she looked statuesque and regal. She was wearing the same white skirt without a slip, and the penetrated light gave me a clear view of her legs. It looked like I had my conspirators. I felt as if the air had been knocked out of me. For the brief moment I had been in her presence, I became almost infatuated with Pye O'Shea. I didn't want her to be involved in the killing of her husband. I drew my Smith & Wesson revolver and sighed. I had my job to do. I walked down the street with the pistol at my side. Just before I got to the house, I slipped down a neighbor's driveway and inched my way along the building line until I was at the side of the O'Shea house. Pye's new home would be less accommodating. I crouched and duck-walked to the living room window. The widow and Marilu were inches apart, the professor's back to me. Pye had a solemn expression on her lovely face. Whacking up $500,000 can be serious business. I made my way to the rear of the house and entered through the open kitchen door. I heard muffled voices from the living room. As quietly as I could, I pushed the kitchen door open an inch. I was able to see Pie, but Marilou was obscured. She glanced past him, saw me, and her eyes went wide. It was now or never. I crouched low and barged into the living room. Marilou whirled, gun in hand.
Freeze!
Marilou leveled the pistol at me and fired. The professor clutched his stomach and went down. I jumped him and kicked the gun away. While I held my pistol on Pie O'Shea, I felt a pulse on Danton Marilou. He was dead.
Johnny, please put the gun down.
Not a chance, sweetheart. You're going to jail for the murder of your husband.
Johnny, you're wrong.
Oh, I am I? What was Marilou doing here? From behind me, I heard a voice say,
He came here to kill her, Dollar.
I turned to see Alan Karpus emerge from the kitchen. He had a .45 Colt automatic in his hand. In addition to being scared, I was confused.
What? You followed Marilou. I followed you. Simple. Take your gun out of your holster and drop it on the floor.
You and Marilou?
Me and Jim Wyman. Marilou's dead, Dollar. We lured him here because him and Wyman could pass for brothers. Jim was an unemployed actor with visions of grandeur. For a partnership in the restaurants, he took out my partner.
What about her?
She's a smart broad, Dollar. Couldn't afford to have her around. House robbery gone bad. Would have worked.
You killed my husband.
He found out I'd been skimming, threatened to sue me for my end of the business. He had to go. Now it's your turn.
A shot smashed through the living room window. Karpus's head snapped back, and he went down like a week-old souffle. Pie screamed. Blown in off its hinges by a sledgehammer, splintered across the living room rug. Charles Walters marched in like Patton crossing the Rhine. What kept you?
I came here looking for the dame. I had to get it straight before I acted.
Hey, Charlie, another fraction of a second, we would have been DOA.
Trust me, never would happen.
You set this up?
Yes, he set it up. But he thought you were the killer. In cahoots with this phony professor here.
Is that true, Johnny?
Hey, look, you two work out the particulars. I'm going to call the meat wagon. Excuse me, where's the phone?
Okay, let's get out of this room. Something's been nagging me about the professor. While I was interviewing him in this room, he pointed to one of his children in a picture and described him as the oldest.
That told you something?
Pie. The man was supposed to be a professor of English literature. He spoke well, or at least gave the impression that language was important to him. But he said oldest. If you have two kids, one is older, not oldest. Grammar school English. If he'd had more children, oldest would have been right. But I asked. He said he only had the two kids. A little mistake, but I filed it. Then I experimented with the bike. If you're riding a bike and turn the handlebar sharply to the left, the bike will go in the opposite direction. In other words, it'll go to the right. The opposite applies if you go the other way.
Well, that makes sense.
Little sense or not, it's true. So, the way the professor described the incident had to be false, which means he killed him. Probably broke his neck and staged the accident.
All over the restaurants.
It's money, Pie. Charlie Walters came back into the room.
They're on their way.
I nodded and looked at the door. He took the hint.
I'll be outside.
You thought I hired this killer?
Yes. I'm sorry. Forgive me.
Yes, of course.
We talked a little longer. The morgue attendants arrived. I suggested to Pie that she might want to stay at a friend's house for the night.
I'll stay here. Can I call you, Johnny?
You certainly can.
I'm not one to run away from things, Johnny.
Southern tradition?
Correct.
Expense account total, including hotel, food, and rental car, $314.85. I spoke to Pi O'Shea yesterday. She's up for dinner with me, but it'll have to wait a year. Another fine Southern tradition. Yours truly, Johnny Dollar.
Like what you hear? Just go to Amazon and search for Joe Bev.